One of the best things that I ever learned about color grading was taught to me by an editor, the great Walter Murch. In his book, In the Blink of an Eye, Murch talks about the concept of referred pain, which essentially says that even though we may feel there's a problem with a particular moment or scene in a film, the true source of that problem is often somewhere else entirely. And this happens in color all the time. In fact, I think the ability to trace this referred pain to its true origin is one of the key things that I bring to the table as a colorist. So today we're going to take a look at 3 examples of this that I see over and over again when I'm grading. Let's get into it. So let's take a look at some common examples of this concept of referred pain that we're talking about today. For our first example, I'm going to look at shot number 1 here, which currently has no grade on it at all, and I'm going to start the grade off the way I start most of my grades off, which is to drop an instance of my colloid print DCTL into the node graph. Now, what's your reaction when you see me drop this DCTL onto the stack? It's immediately got way too much contrast, and we're probably going to say we need to back that off. That's way too much contrast. We're clipping out all kind of detail in the bottom end, and the shadows are just way too thick. But this is a perfect example to me of this referred pain concept, because I can tell you from experience that what's needed here is actually not less contrast, but more exposure. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go upstream to node number 1 here, and I'm going to back off my contrast, and that is certainly helping to remedy the problem. It's certainly a more legible image now than with this node turned off. And let's just grab a still of this for a reference. And now I'm going to delete node number 1 and prepend a new node and do this the way that I know it ought to be done, which is to drop an instance of my exposure DCTL into the node graph. If I didn't have the exposure DCTL, I could use my offset wheel as a rough analog, but I like to work with my exposure tool. So I've got this dropped on, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to add about a stop of exposure to this image. And then let's compare this to what we did a moment ago, where we were instead backing off our contrast. And I think we can all agree that this is a more vibrant and stronger image than this one where we simply backed off on the contrast. So perfect case in point of referred pain. We feel like we need to pull back on contrast, but what we actually need to do is increase our exposure. Next, I want to go to shot number 2 here, and we're going to address another really common note that we're going to get on a lot of different grades. After I drop my print DCTL onto the stack and I look at this, I may very well have the sense that I want to push this even further in terms of the colorfulness and really feel these colors pop. That's a common piece of feedback and a common direction that we might want to go in our grade. And the easiest knob to reach for in that scenario would be my saturation knob, like so. And let's just go really crazy with it and go to like 65 on the saturation and see how that feels. So we can grab a still of this like we did in our prior shot so that we can compare to what we're going to do next. So let's grab a still on that, and I'm going to delete node number 2, and we're going to get at this a different way. This scenario of referred pain is one in which we feel like we need more saturation, but what we actually need is more separation, meaning we need a stronger spread of colors from one quadrant to another. Right now, everything is kind of dominating inside of one quadrant of my vector scope, and if I want to get some better separation, I really need to be spanning one or more quadrants in my scope here. So to do that, I'm going to go to my colloid tools, and I'm going to go to my Kelvin tool, drop it on here, and I'm going to cool things off about 1500 degrees. And let's have a look at what that looks like. I have not directly added any saturation, but the feeling of colorfulness and the feeling of separation is really coming to life with that simple adjustment. And once again, if I compare to our prior version where we were simply pumping saturation into the frame, this to me feels more polished, more nuanced, and less imposed than our first crack at the colorfulness note. So, second example of this referred pain concept. We often feel like, oh, I need more color, I need more saturation, but what we really need is better separation. You can see here in my vector scope, after having made this Kelvin adjustment, I've got a much stronger spread running from my upper left quadrant to my lower right quadrant than I did a moment ago. So that's example number 2. Finally, let's look at shot number 3 here, and I'm once again going to drop an instance of the print DCTL onto the stack. And my feedback here is going to be, I kind of like the moodiness of the overall frame, and I'm not mad at things kind of living a little bit underexposed, but we need to bring up our talent. She's too dark. So let's get a power window out and bring her up. And let's give that a try. Let's do that version of the idea first. So I'm just going to do a rough shape here, and we're going to go in, and I'm just going to go to my offset, and we're going to pick her up like so. And that's not bad. Let's grab a still on that. And now we're going to skin it a slightly different way. So I'm going to delete node number 3. I'm going to delete node number 2. And the idea here that I've talked about before in other videos is that anytime you're drawing a window on your central subject, on the main subject of your frame, that should be a red flag to you, because my question would be, why is it that your subject isn't properly exposed at the foundational level of your grade? Right now, my subject, the girl in the center of the frame, is under. So regardless of what I might like or dislike about the rest of the frame contents, I should focus on parking my exposure in a way that best flatters my subject and then deal with the rest of the frame. So I'm going to go back to my colloid toolkit here. I'm going to go back to exposure, and I'm going to set my exposure in order to best flatter my subject, like so. So maybe that's a little hot. Maybe we do 3/4 of a stop instead of a full stop, but we now have a properly exposed subject, and I simply need to deal with the surroundings feeling a little distracting and a little hot. So rather than windowing her and bringing her up, I'm going to expose the entire frame properly for my subject and then bring things down around her. So I'm going to do a new node with a circle window, but instead of drawing a window around her that I'm going to use to adjust her, I'm going to do an inverse node like so, an inverse window that is, and we're going to bring everything down around her using my offset. And let's go back up to our gallery here and do a wipe and look at the before and after. And maybe I want to come a little bit further down with this. So in this case, I'm getting a similar result, although I prefer what I'm getting here, but conceptually I have a stronger, cleaner, simpler approach by thinking first about properly exposing my subject and then dealing with whatever that does to my background or the other contents or objects of my frame. So this is my final example of referred pain for you guys here today, and that's that often when we have the impulse to bring something up, we actually need to bring everything else down on top of a proper exposure, which in the case of this shot, we didn't quite have when we had that initial itch of like, oh, we better bring up our subject. Our subject should be properly exposed by the time we're done setting our primary grade, and then we should be controlling and knocking things down ideally rather than building things up. So that's a couple great examples of referred pain for you guys. I hope that helps you get a sense for what I mean when I bring up this concept, and I hope these are some ideas that you can bring into your grades. Now that we've explored some examples, I hope when you're grading that you'll start to consider whether the impulse that you're having or the notes that you're getting might not be a case of referred pain. As Walter Murch points out in his book, the worst thing we can do in this situation is address the note at face value. All we're really doing then is taking one problem and turning it into two. But with a little bit of practice, we can all become better diagnosticians and as a result, better problem solvers. If you have examples or anecdotes of your own on this topic, I'd love to hear about them down below. See you next time.